Japan did not enter the automobile age by choice. It was pushed there by disaster. On September 1st, 1923, the Great Kanto earthquake shattered the Tokyo-Yokohama region and turned transport into a survival problem. A modern city can survive damage. It cannot survive paralysis. People have to move. Supplies have to arrive. Fuel, food, workers, and tools all have to keep flowing. And when Japan needed that movement most, the vehicles that answered were not Japanese. That is where this story begins, not with Toyoda's rise, but with Japan discovering, in public and under pressure, how dependent it really was. That gap would define the next phase of the story. Because crisis does more than expose weakness, it reveals who is ready. In the aftermath of the earthquake, American automakers had the advantages that mattered most. They could move faster, they could supply more cheaply, they could respond with industrial confidence at exactly the moment Japan had no time to waste. So the earthquake did not simply accelerate the use of automobiles in Japan, it accelerated the logic of foreign automotive dominance. That is what makes this chapter more than historical background. The Great Kanto earthquake did not create Toyota, but it created the conditions that made a company like Toyota necessary. It proved that mobility was no longer optional. It was tied to resilience, recovery, and national capacity. A country that could not move under pressure could not fully control its own future. And once that truth became visible, the stakes changed. This was no longer just about machines. It was about industrial independence. The road to Japan's automotive future had opened, but it had opened under pressure and in the shadow of foreign strength. American vehicles were already meeting Japanese needs. American firms were already shaping the market. And that raised the real question at the center of the story. If disaster had made the automobile indispensable, was there still room for a Japanese company to fight its way into a future that already seemed to belong to someone else? The road to Japan's automotive future had opened, but it had opened under pressure and in the shadow of foreign strength. If Japan was going to build an industry of its own, it would need more than demand. It would need capital. It would need engineering. And above all, it would need a way of thinking powerful enough to survive against companies that were already bigger, faster, and better established. That part of the story did not begin in a car factory. It began in a loom workshop. Long before Toyota became associated with engines, assembly lines, or global scale, the Toyota family was known for machinery built for the textile industry. Sakichi Toyoda had spent years trying to solve a problem that was easy to overlook and brutally expensive to ignore: how to make production more reliable while reducing wasted labor. His work was not glamorous. It was practical, repetitive, and deeply industrial. But that is exactly why it mattered. He was not chasing prestige. He was trying to build machines that could remove friction from human work and expose failure before failure spread. That effort reached its most important early expression in the Type G automatic loom, completed in 1924. On the surface, it was a breakthrough in textile machinery. In reality, it carried something much larger inside it. The loom could detect problems and stop itself when something went wrong. That single principle would echo far beyond textiles. A machine should not blindly continue producing bad output. It should recognize abnormality, stop, and force correction at the source. Years later, that logic would become one of the deepest ideas inside Toyota. But here, at the beginning, it was still only a loom. A highly sophisticated one, but a loom nonetheless. That is what makes this chapter so important. Toyota's real origin was not just financial, it was philosophical.
The company that would later become famous for manufacturing discipline first learned one of its defining lessons in cloth, thread, and mechanical precision. Before there were cars, there was already a belief taking shape inside the Toyota world. Waste should be exposed, defects should not be passed along, and machinery should serve intelligence rather than replace it. In other words, the future company's operating instinct existed before the future company itself did. But philosophy alone does not fund an industrial leap. It has to become structure. It has to become money. And by the mid-1920s, that process was already underway. In 1926, Toyota Automatic Loom Works was established, giving the family's machinery business a formal industrial base. That matters because this was no longer just invention in isolation. It was a real company with products, organization, and the beginnings of corporate scale. The Toyotas now had something more dangerous than talent. They had a platform. Then, in 1929, that platform gained the one thing bold decisions always need: usable capital. The patent rights to the Type G loom were sold to Platt Brothers in England. The transaction did more than validate Sakichi's invention internationally. It created the financial bridge that would later help support the automotive gamble. This is the moment when the story tightens. The loom business was no longer just a successful past. It was becoming the source of a possible future. The money earned from textile innovation would help finance a move into an industry far more expensive, more competitive, and more uncertain than anything the company had attempted before. And this is where Toyota's creation starts to look different from the myths that came later. It was not the story of a car company suddenly appearing out of nowhere. It was the story of one industrial logic preparing to move into another field. The Toyotas did not begin with automobiles. They began with disciplined invention, with machinery that revealed failure, and with a business strong enough to generate the means for reinvention. By the end of the 1920s, they had something rare: philosophy, structure, and money. What they did not yet have was justification, because having the means to enter automobiles was not the same as having a reason. Japan's roads were opening. American manufacturers were already stronger. The market was not waiting for a newcomer. So the real question was no longer whether the Toyota family could imagine building cars. It was whether anyone inside that loom company would be bold enough to risk a proven business on an industry that already seemed to belong to someone else.
The loom had created the means, but it had not yet created the decision. By the end of the 1920s, the Toyota family possessed something many companies never do: a working industrial base, a respected inventor's legacy, and fresh capital from a successful patent rights deal. What they did not possess was a safe path forward. Japan's automotive future was already beginning to take shape, and it was not taking shape around them. Ford had established Ford Japan in Yokohama in December 1924 and began assembly production in March 1925. General Motors followed in Osaka, beginning assembly production in April 1927. By the time the Toyotas looked seriously at automobiles, the market did not look open. It looked occupied. That is what makes Kiichiro Toyoda's role so important. He was not inheriting a clear opportunity. He was choosing to move toward a dangerous one. In 1930, he began automotive surveys and research in earnest, studying a field that was already dominated by foreign scale and experience. This was not an obvious extension of the family business. Looms and automobiles did not share the same economics, the same supply chains, or the same capital requirements. The leap from one to the other was not a product expansion. It was a transformation of identity. The decisive moment came on September 1st, 1933. That was the day Toyota Automatic Loom Works established its automotive production division. The significance of that date is hard to overstate. Before it, automobiles were a possibility being studied by an ambitious executive inside a loom company. After it, they became a company-level commitment. People would be assigned, money would be spent,
Engineering effort would be redirected. Time would be consumed. The family was no longer imagining an automotive future, it was beginning to pay for one. And almost immediately, that commitment demanded more than curiosity. It demanded proof. In 1934, the company completed its first engine prototype and officially entered the automotive business. Then came the real test. In August 1935, the first Model G1 truck prototype was completed. It was Toyota's first production vehicle, introduced that November, powered by a 3.4-liter Type A engine and priced below a comparable Ford chassis. But the achievement was not clean. During a long-distance test drive in September 1935, part of the rear axle housing broke, raising doubts about whether this fledgling manufacturer could truly withstand the road. That detail matters because it strips away the myth. Toyota was not born polished. It was born under pressure, making mistakes in public while trying to force itself into an industry that had no reason to wait for it. What Kiichiro was betting on then was not immediate superiority. It was the possibility that a company built on disciplined invention could learn fast enough to survive long enough. That is a very different kind of confidence. It is one thing to challenge a weak market. It is another to challenge Ford and General Motors when they are already assembling locally, already shaping customer expectations, and already using their scale to make domestic entry feel almost irrational. Kiichiro's move only makes sense if he believed that staying inside the safety of looms carried its own danger, that the future would belong to companies willing to build it before the odds looked favorable. So this is the chapter where Toyota's creation becomes irreversible. The company has now crossed the line from philosophy to risk, from inherited strength to exposed ambition. It has built an automotive division, produced an engine, and put a truck on the road. The question is no longer whether the Toyotas can imagine becoming car makers. The question is, what happens when a small domestic challenger, still proving it can build reliably at all, is forced to survive inside a market that will not protect it on sentiment alone? And if private conviction was enough to begin this fight, who would decide whether it could continue?
Making the bet was one thing. Turning that bet into a real company was something else entirely. By the mid-1930s, Kiichiro Toyoda had already pushed the family's loom business into automotive research, built an engine, and put the first truck on the road. But none of that solved the deeper problem. Toyota was still a small, domestic challenger trying to enter an industry where Ford and General Motors already had scale, experience, and a running start inside Japan. Private conviction could begin the fight. It could not, by itself, change the battlefield. That battlefield changed in 1936. On May 29th of that year, Japan promulgated the Automotive Manufacturing Industries Law, and it came into effect on July 11th. The law did not simply regulate the market, it reshaped it. Toyota Automatic Loom Works applied for a license on July 23rd, and on September 19, 1936, it was designated a licensed company by the Ministry of Commerce and Industry. In practical terms, the government had decided that domestic automobile manufacturing was too important to leave entirely to market forces. The company was no longer just chasing an industrial dream. It was being drawn into a national strategy. That mattered for two reasons at once. First, it gave Toyota a path to survival in a market that might otherwise have been impossible to enter. The company now had legal recognition as one of Japan's chosen automotive makers. But second, it raised the stakes of failure. Once the state begins to protect an industry, the companies inside that protected circle are no longer just private experiments. They become tests of whether national industrial policy can work. Toyota was being given an opportunity, but it was also being handed a burden. It now had to prove that the gamble on domestic auto manufacturing was justified. Even the company's name was changing under this new pressure. In October 1936, the name used for the automobile business shifted from Toyota to Toyoda.
alongside the adoption of the Toyota logo and the rollout of a dealer network. On the surface, that looks like branding. In reality, it signals something deeper. A family invention business was starting to harden into a public industrial identity. The company was preparing not just to build vehicles, but to exist as something larger than the family that had created it. The decisive break came the following year. On August 28, 1937, Toyota Motor Company Limited was established as a separate company. That is the formal corporate birth date most people recognize. But what makes it dramatic is not the paperwork alone, it is what the paperwork made unavoidable. A separate company meant separate risk, separate capital needs, and separate expectations. From that moment on, Toyota was no longer an automotive division sheltered inside a loom manufacturer. It was a car company, exposed to the full cost of becoming real. And becoming real was expensive. Shortly after its establishment, Toyota held the groundbreaking ceremony for the Corolla plant on September 29, 1937. Japan was already under wartime pressure, steel was expensive and difficult to obtain, and even basic construction required improvisation. Toyota's own history notes that the steelmaking department of Toyota Automatic Loom Works helped by manufacturing reinforcement bars for the plant. That detail matters because it shows how incomplete this creation still was. The new car company could not yet stand entirely on its own. It still depended on the industrial muscles of the old, loom-rooted business to build the future it was chasing. By November 1938, the first phase of the Corolla plant was completed. The site covered roughly 500,000 square meters, with about 200,000 square meters of building area and total construction costs of 45 million yen. This was no longer a speculative side project. It was steel, concrete, land, machinery, and commitment at industrial scale. Toyota had crossed the line from experiment to infrastructure. And once a company builds infrastructure like that, retreat becomes far more difficult than advance. So this is the chapter where Toyota stops being a possibility and becomes a burden the company must carry forward. State policy has opened a path. The corporate shell now exists. The plant is rising. The name is changing. The bet has hardened into an institution. But institutions do not get judged by ambition. They get judged by whether they can survive the world they are built into. And if Toyota was now real enough to stand on its own, was it also real enough to endure what came next? Toyota was now real enough to fail at full scale. The name had changed. The company had been separated from the loom business. The plant had been built. The state had cleared a path for domestic automakers and pushed them into a more serious industrial future. On paper, this should have been the chapter where the gamble began to look justified. Instead, it became the chapter where the entire creation story nearly broke apart. The pressure came after the war, when Japan entered one of the harshest economic contractions of the early post-war period. The Dodge Line recession tightened credit, depressed demand, and exposed every weak point in companies that had expanded under very different conditions. For Toyota, this was not an abstract macroeconomic shock. It was a direct threat to survival. The company had already taken on the burden of becoming a real automaker, and now it faced a business environment that was stripping away any room for error. The question was no longer whether Toyota could build cars. It was whether Toyota could stay alive long enough for that effort to matter. By the period ending March 31st, 1950, the company recorded a loss of 76.52 million yen. That number matters not only because it was severe, but because it arrived at the worst possible point in Toyota's development. This was still a young manufacturer with limited financial cushion, unfinished scale, and no guarantee that domestic auto demand would recover quickly enough to save it. The company was carrying the weight of a dream,
before it had earned the stability to sustain one. And once losses reached that level, the logic of crisis moved inside the walls. Management could not treat the problem as temporary. It had to act. That is where the story becomes painful. In April 1950, Toyota proposed a reconstruction plan that included 1,600 voluntary retirements and a 10% wage cut. On paper, it was a survival measure. In practice, it detonated the company's deepest internal fault line. The proposal collided with earlier commitments and with the livelihoods of workers who had already lived through years of instability. What had begun as a strategic industrial bet was now being paid for in jobs, wages, and trust. The enemy was no longer only outside the company. It was now the possibility that Toyota would destroy itself from within while trying to remain solvent.
The dispute stretched on and hardened. Labor and management negotiations deteriorated into a prolonged conflict, and the crisis stopped feeling like a restructuring problem and started feeling like a test of whether the company could hold together at all. This is what makes the chapter so important in Toyota's creation story. Many corporate origin myths are built around moments of invention, launch, and early success. Toyota's is built just as much around the moment when its own people could no longer agree on how the company should survive. The dream of a domestic automaker had reached the point where it was inflicting damage on the very organization that was supposed to carry it forward. And at the center of that pressure stood Kiichiro Toyoda. He had been the one who pushed the family business into automobiles. He had turned curiosity into division, division into prototypes, and prototypes into a real company. But this was the cruel logic of the pivot. The same person who forced Toyota into the future now had to watch that future threaten the company's cohesion. On June 5, 1950, Kiichiro resigned as president to take responsibility for the labor dispute. 5 days later, on June 10th, the dispute concluded. Those dates are not just milestones. They are the emotional center of the chapter. Toyota survives, but the founder figure of its automotive gamble has to step aside for that survival to become possible. That resignation matters because it breaks the easy version of the story. Kiichiro does not get a clean triumph. He does not carry the company uninterrupted from idea to empire. Instead, he becomes something more complicated and, in some ways, more dramatic. The architect of the gamble who pays for its survival with his own position. That is a very different kind of founding image. It means Toyota's creation was not sealed by victory. It was sealed by sacrifice. The company that would later become famous for discipline, endurance, and long-term thinking first learned those lessons at the edge of internal collapse. So this is the lowest point in the film for a reason. By 1950, Toyota had a company name, a plant, a product history, and a place inside Japan's protected industrial framework. None of that was enough to guarantee survival. What nearly destroyed Toyota was not a lack of ambition or even a lack of technical progress. It was the brutal reality that building an industry and sustaining a company are not the same thing. One requires vision, the other requires endurance under pressure so intense it can tear a company apart from the inside. If the story ended here, Toyota would not look like the beginning of an empire. It would look like a warning about what happens when industrial ambition outruns financial stability. But history did not stop in June 1950. The company had survived, barely, and survival had left it scarred. The question now was whether that scar would become the mark of a failure that never recovered, or the beginning of a harder, more disciplined kind of company. The question now was whether that scar would become the mark of a failure that never recovered, or the beginning of a harder, more disciplined kind of company. History answered that question in a way that was both decisive and deeply uncomfortable. On June 25, 1950, North Korea crossed the 38th parallel and the Korean War began. For Toyota, still reeling from internal conflict and financial weakness, the war did not arrive first as geopolitics. It arrived as demand. Japan was the nearest industrial base to the battlefield, and almost immediately the US military began looking for vehicles it could procure fast. A company that had just survived a near breaking point was suddenly being asked to build again at speed. The shift came with startling force. As early as July 10th, Toyota received an inquiry from the procurement division of the 8th United States Army concerning trucks. An agreement followed on July 31st for 1,000 Model BM trucks, with deliveries spread across August, September, and October. Then came more orders, 2,329 additional trucks on August 29, 1950, and another 1,350 on March 1, 1951. In total, Toyota received orders for 4,679 Model BM trucks worth 3.66 billion yen. For a company that had only just endured a 76.52 million yen loss and a paralyzing labor dispute, that was not just business, it was oxygen. What makes this moment dramatic is not only the size of the rescue, but its irony. Toyota had nearly collapsed trying to become a viable automaker in peacetime. Then war, once again, reshaped its future. The company's own history is blunt about the effect. Business performance improved rapidly as a result of Korean War special procurement demand. The same company that had been forced to cut jobs and wages now had a reason to increase output. Monthly production plans rose from 650 units to 1,000. Employees worked overtime. Product transition plans were delayed so the company could concentrate on filling BM truck orders. Toyota was no longer trying merely to stop the bleeding. It was moving again. But this chapter matters because Toyota did more than survive the emergency. It learned from it. Scarcity had always been the company's condition. It did not have Ford's capital cushion or Detroit's room for waste. And that meant survival could not depend on brute scale alone. Toyota had to become more disciplined than its rivals, more attentive to bottlenecks, more intolerant of defects, and more exact about flow. Years later, Toyota would describe the Toyota production system as rooted in two pillars: Jidoka, stopping immediately when abnormalities are detected, and just in time, making only what is needed, when it is needed, and in the amount needed. Those ideas were not post-war management slogans. They were answers to the kind of pressure Toyota had lived through. And this is where the Loom returns to the center of the story. Toyota's own explanation of TPS traces its roots back to Sakichi Toyoda's automatic Loom, which built the capability to make judgments into the machine itself and gave birth to the concept of Jidoka. The company also traces just in time to Kiichiro Toyoda's conviction that a complete car cannot be built if even one part is missing, and that without a unique way to organize tens of thousands of parts, no amount of money would be enough. In other words, the company that seemed to be surviving an automotive crisis was actually rediscovering the logic that had existed before it ever built a car. Stop the error early, eliminate waste, and treat coordination as a weapon. That is why this chapter is not just a comeback chapter. It is a transformation chapter. Toyota had been saved by war orders, but it was being remade by the discipline that survival demanded. The company could not afford to build like its larger competitors. It had to build with greater awareness, tighter synchronization, and a deeper respect for the cost of every delay, every defect, and every idle stockpile. What had once been a loom maker's way of thinking was now becoming an automaker's operating system. And that shift is more important than any single procurement contract, because contracts end. Systems compound. So by the early 1950s, Toyota was no longer just the company that had survived a near-fatal crisis. It was becoming something harder to defeat. a company that had been forced to think under pressure and had learned how to turn that pressure into method. The road ahead was still long. Toyota had not yet become the global force people know today. But the balance of the story had changed. The company was no longer living only from one emergency to the next. It was beginning to build a repeatable way of working, one strong enough to outlast the crisis that had revealed it. And once a company learns how to survive by building differently, what happens when that discipline finally meets scale?
By the early 1950s, Toyota was no longer just the company that had survived. It was becoming the company that had learned. That difference matters because survival can be temporary. Learning can compound. The Loom business had given Toyota its earliest logic. Crisis had forced that logic into sharper form. And now, as the years moved forward, the company began doing something more consequential than simply staying alive. It began turning discipline into scale. That transformation did not happen in a single leap. It happened model by model, plant by plant, year by year, until the company's internal way of building became large enough to shape the market around it. The clearest symbol of that shift was the Corolla. Introduced in the 1960s and later sold in extraordinary volumes across the world, it became proof that Toyota was no longer just a domestic manufacturer trying to protect its place at home. It had become a company capable of producing not merely vehicles, but repeatable trust at global scale. By July 2021, Corolla had crossed 50 million cumulative sales, and by the end of September 2023, cumulative Corolla production had reached 53.399 million. A company that once struggled to justify its existence had created one of the most successful nameplates in automotive history. What makes that payoff so important is that it validates the deeper pattern of the story. Toyota did not rise because one gamble worked quickly. It rose because the company kept converting pressure into method and method into endurance. The same business that had once lived under the shadow of Ford and General Motors built an industrial culture strong enough to outlast competitors, adapt across decades, and keep expanding into new markets without losing the underlying discipline that made the expansion possible. That is the real turning point of the ending. Toyota stops looking like a company that escaped failure and starts looking like a company that learned how to build advantage from the very conditions that once made failure seem likely. By the time Toyota reached 300 million cumulative vehicles produced worldwide, including production through September 2023, the story had moved far beyond the scale anyone inside the old Loom works could have imagined. Officially, Toyota marked that number as having been achieved 88 years and 2 months after the first Model G1 truck was produced by the Automotive Production Division of Toyota Automatic Loom Works in August 1935. That detail is the perfect measure of the full arc. The company that hit 300 million vehicles was still connected, in an unbroken line, to the small automotive division that had once existed inside a loom manufacturer. The empire and the workshop were not separate stories. They were the same story, seen from different distances. The financial scale tells the same story in a different language. For the fiscal year ended March 31st, 2025, Toyota reported total sales revenues of 48.036704 trillion yen and net income of 4.789755 trillion yen. Numbers at that level can feel abstract, almost too large to mean anything. But in this story, they mean something very specific. They mean that the company created through invention, foreign pressure, policy shifts, post-war trauma, and disciplined reinvention did not merely survive its fragile beginnings. It became one of the defining industrial organizations of the modern world. The Loom company did not just build cars. It built a system powerful enough to carry enormous scale without losing the memory of scarcity that formed it. And that is why the ending has to return to the beginning. The most useful way to understand Toyota is not as a car company that once happened to make looms. It is as a loom company that carried its deepest manufacturing instincts into automobiles and then kept compounding them across generations. Sakichi Toyoda's machinery taught the company that defects had to be exposed early. Kiichiro's gamble forced the company into an industry that seemed too expensive and too crowded to enter. The 1950 crisis taught Toyota that a company can be real and still be close to breaking. The years that followed taught it that discipline, once learned under pressure, can become a durable, competitive weapon. The ending only makes sense because every stage before it left something behind that the next stage could use. So when people ask how Toyota was created, the clean corporate answer is August 28, 1937, the day Toyota Motor Company Limited was established. But the truer answer is much harder and much more interesting. Toyota was created in stages. It was created when a loom inventor built machines that could stop themselves when something went wrong. It was created when patent income from those machines made a new gamble possible. It was created when Kiichiro chose to enter a market already shaped by foreign power. It was created again when the company nearly collapsed and discovered what survival would actually cost. And it was created, finally, when all of that pressure hardened into a way of building strong enough to scale across the world. That is the final irony at the heart of the story. The company most people know for cars was first built by people trying to perfect a loom. And the industrial empire that followed was not born from a single moment of genius, but from a chain of decisions, pressures, and reinventions that kept pushing one family business into something larger than it was ever meant to be. The first act of creation happened long before Toyota became famous. The rest was compounding. And if that was the company's first great transformation, what does a business built on that kind of memory become when it is forced to reinvent itself again?